Does foreign aid matter or work?
Well, my short answer is no, and we shouldn't expect it to work. And now we have at least some 7 decades of experience with foreign aid, not just the United States, but other countries' foreign aid, the World Bank, uh, other kinds of government to government aid institutions, and government aid institutions that give to all sorts of types of foreign aid programs. And one thing that stands out is that aid and growth have no relationship to each other. So there's no real correlation between foreign aid and growth. Some countries grow, some countries don't, some countries grow slowly, but the what makes a country grow has nothing to do with aid in the best of cases. In the worst of cases, aid can be very harmful. So um, to me, it's always been much more important to look at the factors that actually do cause development and do cause growth. But we do have a lot of experience with aid, and I think that when you look at sort of the history of foreign aid, you start to see why um, it's been such a disappointing record. And it's been disappointing not just to the critics of aid, but to the advocates of aid, which is why every 20 years or so, you get this debate going about, boy, shouldn't we reform the aid program? And the last time around that we had this was almost 20 years ago. And I think that that was really a very good debate that was had when a lot of research, academic research, including at the World Bank and other places, showed that uh, aid really doesn't do much to promote development and can make things worse.
My there's two books I read a while ago that sort of gave me the baseline of like my biases on this. One was The Tyranny of Experts by an economist named Bill Easterly. And that book went into, at essentially said both US government and other governments, as well as like do-gooder NGO types like Bill Gates, think they can architect the world, but that's the same reason why socialism doesn't work, essentially. Like, they don't have the knowledge of the local conditions and all the complexities. So they basically come in like a bull in a china shop. And the book went through a bunch of histories of just interventions, again, not just by governments, but by organizations like the Ford Foundation in China that were really destructive. And then the second one, which was sort of like a story of one example, which was The Idealist by Nina Monk, where she's this Vanity Fair, if I remember correctly, writer who got enamored with Jeffrey Sachs, who current people actually are familiar with because he's been out about Ukraine and been skeptical of the U.S. position on Ukraine. But before that, he's an international economist, and he decided, I'm going to raise a bunch of money and like turbocharge some small villages in Africa, and he created this Millennium Villages project. And her book is her going from being excited about this idealist do-gooder to chronicling the kind of stumbling, bumbling, destructive idiocy that unfolded when he tried to do it. And he didn't particularly like that. And then the story also ends up being about his hubris and disconnection from the process. Um, how how useful are those two books from your perspective? Did they skew my understanding? Like, help me understand where I got things right and wrong from that perspective.
No, I think that those are two excellent books because they happen to be one by Bill Easterly, who by the way used to be a top economist at the World Bank, doing research among other things on the effectiveness of foreign aid. And because of what his research was finding, he was fired from that job, and then he just became a professor at New York University. And he's a leading development economist who then got into this big debate exactly with Jeffrey Sachs some 20 years ago, who was making the case that what the poor world needs is massive increase in foreign aid because they're stuck in what he called a poverty trap. And so the debate went back and forth. Should we increase massively foreign aid, or should we scale it back because of the things that Bill Easterly and most other researchers found? And so the books that you just mentioned sort of were part of that debate. And I think that they're pretty representative of of both sides. A lot of people who had been advocates of aid became disillusioned with it, or at the very least, really scaled back their expectations of what aid can do. And yes, if you spend money on something charitable, the people who receive that aid will definitely benefit from that. Whether it can be done better in one way or the other is a different story. But that is a very different claim than saying foreign aid is something that you can use in order to not just promote development, but pull entire countries out of poverty into self-sustaining growth. And that's a fantasy. And I think that that's what the most of the academic literature has concluded now we should get away from. But there's a big gap between the scholarly work and the political world, where there's always a push for more and more aid, which we're kind of seeing right now in the political debate. But anyway, Bill Easterly's the right guy. He also wrote a book called The White Man's Burden that's on similar themes. He's written several books on development that I think are really important to understand what causes development and what role aid plays in that. I met Bill in the early to mid 1990s when he was an economist, and I don't think that he's going to mind me telling this story at this time. At the time, this was in 1994, we published a book at the Cato Institute that I co-edited on the failure of the World Bank and the IMF, and it was an indictment of foreign aid. And so the top World Bank vice president for uh, outside relations called me and said, "Look, we should sit down and talk about this because I think we have a new president at the World Bank, and we see much more eye to eye than you might think, and we can work together. We're now so much more pro-market and so on." Okay, so we went out to lunch, and I went with a colleague, and they brought their heavy hitter Bill Easterly to the table, and they made a lot of the vice president was making a lot of arguments. We made a lot of counter arguments that I think carried the day, and Bill Easterly sat silently the entire time, and I could tell that he was in no mood to support the arguments that the World Bank was was putting out. And ever since then, we've been, we've been in touch, and I think I've been a big fan of his work. But I think his intellectual evolution is very representative of the people who actually have studied foreign aid closely.
I have heard this, that in intellectual circles, Bill Easterly has, if not one, is not in disrepute.
Not at all.
And
He's very well regarded.
and so, frankly, I personally am almost shocked by that because, in a world where academia seems to be increasing its percentage of staff members who like communism, the notion that any elite institution could go in the correct direction while still being academic minded almost seems antithetical to some immutable laws of degradation of academia that I think I've come to understand. So why do you think it is that um, that this international aid industry has even been able to embrace it? Because it seems like it's almost against their interest, because he's fundamentally arguing like we shouldn't be doing much of the stuff we're doing.
Well, the aid industry has not embraced that argument. That's why they fired him, right? And this is a problem that we know from just public choice theory, political science, which is that once you create a government program and all of the interests that form around it, it's very difficult to scale that back or to shut it down or to turn it in the other direction. And then foreign aid is not an exception to that story. And when foreign aid was born after the Second World War, there was this theory that um, all these poor countries should become more developed market democracies, maybe, but there must be a reason why they're poor. And so all sorts of experts came up with plans that departed from the market type institutions and policies that made every developed country developed, under the theory that those rules and those ideas don't really apply to these people, and therefore there has to be all sorts of government programs and massive wealth transfers from rich countries to poor countries. And that actually really did help to keep those countries poor, and in the worst of cases ended up supporting dictatorships, undermining private property rights, increasing massively the regulatory state. Central planning was supported by foreign aid, and on, and increases in debt to unsustainable levels. So foreign aid really does have a miserable history. And even when countries do the right things, aid really doesn't have a role, because basically when you have all of the worst policies on record and you pour money into that environment, it makes things worse. And
see the public school system in the United States.
Yes, and at some point in the early 1980s, aid agencies started to figure out and said explicitly, well, we haven't been very successful. Therefore, what we need to do, because the policy environment is not good, is change the policy environment. So now we will give aid conditioned on policy reforms. They adopt more market-oriented reforms and so on. And that didn't work either, because it was obvious from the beginning that the World Bank or USAID or all these big aid agencies,
the IMF,
the IMF, they have institutional incentives to lend. If they have to lend in order to be relevant, and that's also the way they judge their success. We lent to all these countries, all these programs, and so you put a condition on a loan, and a country doesn't comply with it, they'll get the money anyway the next year. We couldn't do it for XYZ reasons. Well, okay, here's another loan. Please do it. No, we don't. So in practice, this has also been very well studied, the failure of conditioning foreign aid for policy reform. In practice, that has been a failure too. And you should expect that from government policies, government institutions that have to lend money in order to justify their existence, right? And the model itself is bad. When you pay your client to take your advice, that's just a bad model to begin with, right? And so that has also failed. And yet there have been countries that have reformed and so on. So again, scholars have looked into that, and there's no relationship between actual reforms and foreign aid. Reforms happen for a lot of reasons. Foreign aid is not one of the reasons. So not even there does foreign aid have a good record.
Yeah, so it's like you barely even can trip into being there at the same time that a good thing happened. That's the closest you get.
Well,
we happen to be there while other people that aren't us worked around us to make good things happen in spite of us muscling around.
When you give money to almost every country in the world every year for decades on end and something good happens, of course they claim we did look at what our aid did, but that's not a serious analysis.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.